Hey, what's up, everybody? Chad Calek here, and welcome back to the In a Crowded Room podcast for episode number 158, in which we are going to talk about whether or not superhumans and superhuman ability, if they're real, or are they just a thing of the imagination. But before we do, I wanted to ask you guys for a huge favor. About 60% of you that listen to the podcast are, in fact, subscribers. That means 40% of you are not, and I want to make sure that you guys know every time I post a new episode. So if you have not yet, please click on the subscribe button, as well as the notifications bell. And last but not least, if you are able, please visit the Patreon page. The link is in the description box below, where we have all kinds of goodies over there. Photos and videos, there's free movies there, there's a ton of fun stuff. Tomorrow I have a bunch of pictures that are going up from Paranormal State that have never been released. Like I said, all kinds of goodies, and there's going to be a ton of video footage coming up from production of my next film project, House of the Harbinger Kingdom, which you do not want to miss. The best thing about the Patreon page is I've left it where you can choose the level of your donation. It could be $1 a month, $5 a month, 20 a month, whatever you want, whatever works for you. So please consider supporting me at Patreon only if you are able and if you can do so comfortably. And if you can't, that's totally cool. Just continue to tell people about the podcast. It is growing every day. And please make sure to leave me a comment and let me know what you think about the podcast. Or if you have any questions, let me know. If I don't answer in the comment box, I take a lot of my questions from the Q&A episode directly from the comment section. With that being said, let's get into episode number 158 here, Superhumans and Superhuman Ability. I actually got thinking about this topic because there's a new show, I believe it's on either the History Channel or the Discovery Channel, called In Search Of, and it stars Zachary Quinto, who actually plays the young Spock in the new J.J. Abrams revamped Star Trek series. Great actor, a great guy I actually ran into once at Comic-Con, which I'm sure he wouldn't know me if he tripped on me, but I did have a brief conversation with him at the bar down in San Diego, and he was a very nice guy. But in this episode that I watched, basically, he was traveling around the world to try to determine if superhuman ability is real. And what I mean by superhuman ability, for example, he interviewed a guy that was in a car wreck, and he got out of his car, and I believe either it was his son or his brother, somebody very close to him, was inside the car, and it was burning, it was on fire. And he knew if he didn't get him out, he was going to die. And I guess he grabbed the car door and completely bent it, the top of it around the window, pulled it back, bent it down, the glass shattered, and he was able to pull his loved one from the vehicle. And they determined that basically this could be done. I want to believe they said it was like 580 pounds of pressure per square inch, or something crazy, something that was definitely beyond his ability. And they did a series of tests to determine what his strength was. And they had basically this measuring machine where it was kind of like a deadlift machine, where he would just stand, reach down, and he would grab this bar and he would pull up as hard as he could to determine his strength in pulling something towards his chest, like he did the car door. And when it started out, he did like 280 pounds of pressure as far as pulling on this deadlift bar. And it was really interesting. They said, okay, now that you did that, I'm going to have you do it again, and this time I'm going to encourage you. And I was like, what? They're going to encourage him? And he's like, yeah. And he kind of had the same reaction. This gentleman was like, well, what do you mean? And he's like, I'm just going to encourage you, and let's see what you do. And he was like, okay. And he grabbed the bar, and this time they're going, come on, man, you can do it. Go, you can do it. And it was crazy because, his deadlift strength increased by 100 pounds. And he was kind of blown away by it. He was like, wow. And it went from like 280 to like 380. And then they were like, okay, let's do it again. And this time, just the second I say go, just start, doing the deadlift machine. And that's it. He didn't tell him what he was going to do. He just said, when you hear me say go, you know, go, pull up on it. So right before he says go, they let off a foghorn, like right in his ear. And then he screams, go, go, let it off again. And what they're doing is they're basically causing an adrenaline spike. And he went from 280 to 380 to like 420. And he still wasn't even, a couple hundred pounds away from the range that it would take to bend this car door and shatter this glass. But it just, kind of proved that there was a mental capacity here. There was things that you could do mentally that would increase your body's strength, which was really, really impressive. Now, I don't know if that's what I would call superhuman ability, at least what he demonstrated on the show, but certainly bending a car door, and shattering the window. I mean, that's, if I went out to my car right now, I don't think I could bend the car door. And what was crazy is on the car door, you could actually see where he stuck his fingers, where his fingers were, and you could see where his fingers were bending the metal on the car, which to me, that was a pretty amazing demonstration. And I've seen things before that are super impressive. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Wim Hof, the Iceman. It's this guy that, can go jogging through absolutely freezing temperatures in basically shorts and, not get hypothermia. He can sit in ice cold water for incredibly long periods of time. But what's wild is not only can Wim Hof sit in ice water for a long period of time, he can control his inner core body temperature with his mind. And he's done this in a scientific lab setting where not only would he not go into hypothermia, he could actually increase his core body temperature sitting in ice water. And this, like I said, this has been done under the watch of scientists that have confirmed they have no idea how he's doing this. I mean, it's clearly psychosomatic. He can just mind over matter. And that is pretty amazing to me. I've seen old videos before. I don't know if you guys are familiar. There's a really, the cover of the Rage Against the Machine album is this monk that in protest had set himself on fire. His name is Quang Duc. I read all about this guy because the footage absolutely blew me away. And during Vietnam, there were also protests where people would do what they call self-immolation, which is setting themselves on fire. Not only is that an incredibly intense decision to make, what always blew me away about the Quang Duc footage is that without taking any medication, these monks, nothing was in their system. Not only would they light themselves on fire, they would not scream. They would not, yell out in pain. They wouldn't do anything. They would simply sit there until they were dead. And their, body, of course, would fall over. And again, I remember thinking that, to me, is like, even though they're dying, but that superhuman ability to be able to light yourself on fire and not, have any kind of, reaction to it until, you're dead. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. And on this show with Zachary Quinto, they had a monk there they called the Abbot. And it was a guy that had spent his entire life, basically training to take pain. And, essentially what he said, and they showed his whole life of him, taking his bare hands and like punching into rocks and punching into trees. And they show people just like beating them with wood objects and wood sticks and metal sticks. And finally, this was insane. Like the final thing that he had to do to endure pain and show that he had control over pain in his mind is they took these It's hard. You'd have to see it to believe it, but they're like these wooden stakes, and they drove them into his head. There was like 9 of them, and they drove them into his skull, and then they would light these things on fire, and they would burn down to the core of his head, and would shoot this intensely hot pain, into 9 different spots on his head. And the challenge was, until they burned out, he had to sit there without showing any pain. And he did it. So they actually took him on the show with Zachary Quinto. They took him and another guy they found that has a rare, genetic deficiency in which he does not feel pain. This was literally a guy who was born with the inability to feel pain. And this guy had had hundreds of broken bones throughout his life because he doesn't like pain tells us when to stop, right? It tells us when things are wrong. It tells us when we're going to break something. It tells us if we're on fire. It tells us if we're shot. It tells us if we're poked or pinched or hit or whatever. But this guy didn't have that. Because of that, his whole life he suffered all kinds of broken bones and didn't know it. In fact, he was talking about how at one time he completely crushed 3 vertebrae in his back because he was sledding like down a hill, and he jumped off this sled and he did like a scorpion, meaning like he hit face and hands first, and his legs flipped over the back of his head. And he got up to try to walk back, to his friends, and he couldn't. He just fell on the ground, but he didn't feel any pain. So when they took him into the doctor, they're just like, Jesus, man, you've got like 3 shattered vertebrae. You should be screaming right now. And that's how they ultimately discovered that he didn't feel pain. So they took this gentleman, the monk known as the abbot, and Zachary Quinto. And basically they did a MRI type scanner on their brain, and each of them put their hand into cold water. And you could actually see the part of the brain that lights up when there is a pain sensation. And it was super interesting because the guy that could not feel pain, that was born without the ability, he stuck his hand in the cold water and kept it there for a really long time. And as you would suspect, the MRI pretty much showed there was no change in his brain activity. It simply did not register pain. And then Zachary Quinto went just to see what the average person would experience. And in a very short amount of time, he began to experience pain. And he did actually a pretty good job of holding his hand in there for a long time, but his brain scan was lighting up like crazy. I mean, you could see the area of his brain that was just going off because this was hurting him. But what's really interesting is they got to the monk, the abbot, and they were questioning him before he went in, and he said, because they asked him, what do you expect? And he said, I expect there not to be much activity at all. And he said, I have trained myself where I don't feel pain. He basically described it the way I've described it before to Laura when you feel pain and you have to find a way to fight through it, which is you find a shelf for it. You simply remove it from your focus, And, it's something my dad used to say in regards to fear to me. He used to tell me, if you want to change your fear, change your focus. Fear is about focus. If you're afraid of something, find something to focus on that you're not in that moment. And you can control your fear, which I think is a very real thing. But this Abbott guy, it was fascinating. He stuck his hand in the cold water, and right away you can see a little bit of that brain activity where he senses pain, but then it went away. Like the brain activity basically, where in the area of the brain where the pain, would fire, it basically slowed down and stopped where it should have been increasing. The longer that he held his hand, in the ice water, it should have hurt more. And in his case, he had control of it. He slowed it down. He stopped it to the point where his brain activity was virtually identical to the guy that was unable to feel pain, which, once again, just showed me that, mind over matter is a very, very real thing. And I do have experience witnessing this. I don't believe I've ever been in a situation where I demonstrated anything of superhuman ability or anything like that. Uh, there have been situations where I've done things where I felt like autopilot was on. Like I talk about one of the reasons why I wanted to make the film A Blood Red Sky was that home run that I hit when my father came finally, to see me my last game of my senior year. It just something happened. It's so hard to explain, but something happened in that moment where something took over, and it was almost like I wasn't even present for it. I've talked about this before. If you haven't heard me talk about it in detail, it is in an early episode where I talk about my father and his passing. But I do want to share, 3 stories about my father because he, without question, demonstrated this superhuman ability at 3 different times where I was absolutely shocked and just blown away by what I witnessed. The first example I've never actually spoken about before, just because it's a difficult thing to speak about. When I was 7 years old, my mother's father, who I'm named after, Swan Charles, he lived with us. He was my best friend at the time. Absolutely adored everything about this man. He was a war hero. He was a pilot. He used to show me his Purple Hearts. He was shot down, took 2 in the leg in World War II. Just an absolute badass. But the sweetest old man, you could ever meet. And I love stories, and he just had so many stories. And he shared them with me all the time. And I would just sit there for hours and listen to him tell these stories of war and just, like I said, being a general badass, which you'd never guess if you just met him off the street because he just had this just like Kris Kringle smile, man, and just this very cherubic in the way that he would talk, and he was very expressionate. And just, like I said, a best friend, I loved him and still love him and always will. And I was at school one day, and I had horrific asthma when I was younger. And I would have these terrible asthma attacks because Texas is just so damn hot. You go out during PE and run around and play football and sports and everything, and I'd get worked up, and I just couldn't breathe. I mean, it was incredible. Had it really bad. So whenever I'd go to the office, they would give me the inhaler, and they would call, my mother to say, Chad's having another bad asthma attack. And that day specifically, it was really bad. They pretty much got it under control, but they told my mother, it's bad, you should come get him. So she came, to pick me up. By the time she got there, the medicine had done, the inhaler had done its job, and I was still congested, but breathing okay. I knew I'd be okay. So I was like, sweet, kind of get out of school early today. And, my mother said, we got to run to Houston. And Alvin is probably, 35, 40 minutes away from Houston. Houston's a crazy city if you've never been there before. It takes over an hour and 20 minutes to cross the city. That's how big it is. As far as like actual miles, like it's just a sprawling city. And Alvin, was just on like I said, on the outskirts. I didn't know, I can't remember why we had to go to Houston, but we went there, and before we went, we stopped at our house. And my mother went to grab something, and I went to use the bathroom. And on the way out, I remember saying to her, Mom, I think I smell smoke. And she said, well, I don't. And I'm like, no, I think I do. And she's like, really? And she's like, I don't smell anything. Let's go. We got to hustle. And I'm like, okay. So we hopped in the car, and I remember we got to Houston. We went to the mall, and we went in. I can't remember what we did. I think she might have, for some reason in my brain, I think there was some photos or something she picked up. I'm not sure. Um, but we hopped, back in the car and went straight back home. So we were probably gone, I don't know. It takes about 2 hours to go from Alvin to where we went to this mall. It was just outside of Sharpstown, and turned around and went back. And right as we were pulling up to our house, there was just black smoke just billowing out of every window of our house. I mean, it was ungodly. And I was sitting there just going, what is going on? And right when we pulled up, my dad pulled up. He was in his work truck. At that time, he was the head engineer at this concrete company called Custom Concrete. And suddenly I can hear the sirens from the fire truck. And guys, when I say this black smoke was billowing out of every window and door and crack of that place, I mean, our house was raging. I mean, it was a frickin' inferno, man. And I see my dad hop out of the car, and he's pacing back and forth, and I know what he's thinking. He's thinking what I'm thinking is, Grandpa's in there. And he's looking up the street, and the fire truck turns, and it's coming down the street. And I can see, that my dad knows that seconds are going to matter here. And right as the fire trucks pull up, like as they're pulling in, he had made the decision. Fuck it, he's going in and he's going to try to get my grandpa out. And he had no, fire equipment, no mask, no anything. All he knew is that my grandpa's in there. And, we don't know if he's dead, alive, if he's trying to find his way out. We don't know. And my dad goes running into this house that's just, like I said, a raging inferno. And a couple firemen see this as they're pulling in. And as fast as they can, they hop off the truck, gear up, and they go in after him. And man, they were in there for a long, long, long time. And the whole time I'm thinking, oh no, man, I lost my dad. Like, he's in there. He probably, either got burned up or he couldn't find his way out, or I don't know. So I'm trying to process this as a kid. Okay. And when things like this happen to you when you're a child, you can't measure the magnitude of it, and it's almost like it's not real. Like, you still have this false belief as a child that everything's going to work out and everything's going to be okay. And I was just waiting forever, for my dad to come out. And finally he comes out that front door, and he's covered in soot. Like, his arms are black, his face is black. He comes out and he falls down on his knees, and I could see he's just gasping for air. And I try to hop out because we were sitting in the car watching this. And, my mother was outside the car and she was screaming for him and all this stuff. And I tried to run over to him, and a fireman actually grabbed me and just kind of held me and said, calm down, calm down. He needs to be seen by paramedics. And the paramedics run over to him, and I could see that, he's having an extremely hard time breathing. And I'm going, how could he have ran around? I mean, maybe my timing's off, guys, but it seemed like, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes that he was in there. And I thought he was gonna die right there. And the paramedics are working on him, and they've got an oxygen mask on him, and they're doing everything they can do. And he's just laying there, and he's not moving. And I'm just going, God, please, please, Dad, please, please, just just live through this, man. Just live through this. And all of a sudden, he kind of sits up and, he's coughing like crazy and he's, spitting, and they're giving him water and he's taking a drink of the water and he's spitting again. Then he throws up, drinks more water and he throws up again. And then finally he's up on his feet. And I'm like, oh my God, like he's gonna live through this. Like I can't believe how long he was in there. And to make a long story short, because I have two more stories to tell you here, basically what happened is, and I learned this after the fact, my grandpa had fallen asleep in his bed. And they think he was smoking. And he took different medications that made him drowsy and stuff. And I guess it must have knocked him out, and he fell asleep smoking, and the house caught on fire. And they think that he probably died in his sleep. But where his bedroom was at was a bit of a maze. It was kind of weird to get to it, and the house was just kind of situated weird. And, I guess my dad had made his way back to the room, and he had felt that, in this black, smoky, fiery pit, he had felt that it's too hot. I can't go any further. And on his way out, he had ran into the firemen in the black smoke and all this stuff, and basically told them where, my grandpa was. And another fireman basically escorted him towards the door. And the second my dad could make out the light, coming from the front door and the blackness that he was in, he just took off running through the door. And that's where he had fell on the ground. And at that time, he had suffered like first and second degree burns, which are healable, all over, his body, trying to get to my grandpa. And right after he was up and walking around, the firemen had made their way to my grandpa's room. They put out the fire. And I would just never forget this image of them right in front of me, man, taking my grandpa out on this stretcher. And he was, well, yeah, you know what fire does to someone. He was, yeah, he was gone. And yeah, I lost it. I mean, I was just, yeah. And I just looked at my dad and I was just like, I mean, he risked himself, to try to save this man. And I talked to, the firemen later. I mean, not like I sat them down, but I just was just as a child, just kind of asking them, is my dad going to be okay? Is my dad going to be okay? And because I just watched my grandpa, get carted out, and I knew he was dead. And I remember this one fireman saying, I promise you your dad's going to be okay, But he shouldn't be. He shouldn't be running into fires, and you need to tell him how much you love him, but he shouldn't run into fires. I mean, this fireman told me this, and I think what he was thinking was the truth. You shouldn't go running in to a place that's burning, but, my dad was thinking, I can do this. If he's alive, I can get to him. I can do this. And I think this fireman probably wanted my dad to hear it from his kid, to say, Dad, don't risk your life like that, Because from the fireman's perspective, the truth is that things could have got worse. And I understood that. But I also understood that my dad was waiting for help to come and it wasn't there yet. And he knew seconds mattered. And I do. I remember looking at him like, how did he live through this? How did he run around in a raging inferno for 10, 15 minutes, inhaling pure, black smoke the whole time, to the point where he got back to, my grandpa's room that was raging on fire, ran into a fireman, directed him to where, in blackness, mind you, to where my grandpa was, and somehow made it out the front door. Uh, it was mind blowing. And even explaining it to you now, it doesn't do it justice of what I witnessed. And that was the first inclination that I had that, man, there's something different about my dad. There's something different. The fortitude and just, there's something different about him. And what happened next only, served to intensify that belief that I had, which many of you know about this because it's in the American Ghost Hunter documentary. But I only cover it briefly just because it's incredibly difficult to talk about. And I'm not going to get into like overwhelming detail right now, but as many of you know, if you followed me and my history, my father, shortly after this event, about a year later, was in an accident at Custom Concrete where he worked. Essentially, the short version is that he walked into the loader shed, which is where these concrete trucks would come in and they would work on them, and just, they're always breaking down and stuff, and then get them up to speed and they could use them again. And there was a guy that was welding in there and not paying attention, and my dad was just about to show him what he was doing wrong, and these sparks flew from this welder into a 5-gallon drum of oil and gasoline that was drained from another concrete truck that was in there, and it was on wheels, and someone was pulling it and moving it, wasn't paying attention. And my dad didn't see this. This was behind him. And it went up in flames, and my dad knew that, there's all kinds of other vehicles in there, that heat's going to rise. There's, dust and all kinds of stuff that's at the top of the shed. There's oil on the ground. He just knew that this thing is going to start a massive fire, and there's a lot of things that could ignite in here. So he put a tarp on. I threw a tarp over the oil and gasoline drum, and he grabbed it and started rolling it towards the front of this, big machine shed that they were in. And when he was pulling it backwards, and when he got out the front door, the back wheels got caught basically in the concrete lip from the inside of the shed to the outside, which was like a slanted concrete shelf, basically, that you'd roll it up to. Just a thing that you would never see coming, because typically you're not rolling ignited drums of gasoline and oil around. And when that happened, the drum got caught stationary, so all the fluid inside, all the liquid, the gasoline, the oil, came spilling out all over my dad's body. And all fire needs to breathe is oxygen, and once it got out, it ignited him. And he had a uniform on, and the uniforms that were given to him were supposed to be 100% cotton. The tag said 100% cotton, and the lawsuit that they actually won from this afterwards revealed that they were actually 40% polyester mixed with cotton. If you know anything about polyester, it doesn't burn, it melts. So, my dad's entire uniform, melted into his skin. And the places that the uniform weren't, like his arms and his hands and his feet and his neck, and, they ignited. So he's on fire, and where his uniform's at is melting into his skin. And thankfully, there was tons of people that were around him, and no one did anything. Um, but they said that once he was on fire, he got up and he started running around. And in my dad's mind, he said he thought he was rolling around on the ground. And thankfully, his best friend at the time was a guy named Alan Castillo. I'll never forget that name because he saved my father. He saw, my dad immersed in a ball of flames just rolling around. And he jumped out of his loader from about 30 yards away, took off sprinting, and he tackled my dad, and he put my dad's body out with his body. Now, he ended up suffering a bunch of burns on his face and his arms and his neck, and he recovered, thank God. But my dad ended up suffering third-degree burns on over 75% of his body, which fourth degree is to the bone. So, third degree, it's as bad as it gets. And he was life flighted to Houston, at the hospital there before they took him to the burn unit, which I believe is in Galveston. I'm pretty sure it was in Galveston. And what's wild is that same day, the same time that he got burned, like down to almost a minute, I had crushed my ankle while playing basketball at my school. So I was literally being taken in an ambulance to the hospital as my dad was being life flighted to Houston, which is wild if you think about it. But, skipping ahead, and it's weird when I think about that time because I remember it in little snippets, like little pieces of a movie or something. Like I remember the first time they brought us in to see him, and I was shocked because he didn't look like my dad. And the reason being is my dad back then was really, really in shape. He was about 100 and, I don't know, maybe 60, 65 pounds, pretty ripped. And man, he was 220 pounds when I went in to see him. And he just looked like this incredibly bloated version of himself. And the reason being is when you lose that much skin, when you're burned, there's nothing to hold fluids in your body. Your body just bleeds and weeps fluids. So in order to keep you alive, they just have to flood your body with fluid. So they're just pumping him full of saline and like everything you can imagine because he needs more fluid in his body because it's exiting his body at an astronomical rate. So that plus the swelling, from being burned. I remember, my mom saying, there he is. And I literally said to her, where? And she was like, there. And as we were walking towards him, and I was like, oh my God. And, yeah, when you see someone like that, you hear people say things like, he was a broken man and stuff like that. And like I saw a broken man. And knowing how tough he is and seeing the pain that he was in, and they had him on a straight morphine drip. I mean, morphine straight to the heart, just pumping because there's just no way. And even through that, he was still in incredible pain. And the environment's terrifying. Like, if you've ever been in a burn unit, I mean, there's just screaming, ripping through the halls. I mean, it's just, man, burns are nothing to fuck with, man. It is just a bad injury. And I've said this before. It was the first time that I ever, like, prayed in regard to my father is, I prayed that his misery could stop. I prayed that this is how he has to live, and you can't get him any better than take him, because it just seemed like the most humane thing. Why? Just I didn't see any way back. I just thought there is no way back from this. There's no way back. And as I've mentioned many times, twice the doctors brought us in to say goodbye and told us that, by morning he'll be gone. And twice he lived through it. So when they started talking about saying goodbye the third time and stuff, it was just like, hey, man, I ain't having it. My old man's a fucking warrior, man, and he's going to come back. And I started to slowly believe that he wasn't broken, that there was someone there. He was badly injured, man, and he was hurt in ways you can't describe. But he was a warrior, and he was fighting through this. And what was crazy is with these types of burns, it takes months to heal, not like, a few days or a few weeks. A long time. And after 6 weeks, another thing too, his left arm was burned so bad, they wanted to amputate it. They told, my mother, there's no way back from this. Like, it's too damaged. It's going to get infected. It's going to kill him. And he told, my mother, don't sign the papers. Do not let them cut my arm off. I will get through this. Do not let them cut my arm off. Do not sign the papers. Do not allow them to. The doctors were actually quite upset with my mother for that. And my dad said, don't. 6 weeks after he got burned, living in that environment, he had told, my mother, you got to get me out of here. You got to take me home. And he said, if I have to stay in here, I won't make it. And it was the environment of hearing the screaming every day from other people. And he said they'd put him in this tub of bleach water because his whole body was an open wound, and they're afraid of infection. And, he just told my mom, you got to get me out of here, and we'll deal with this at home. And he did. He went home 6 weeks later, and he references this in American Ghost Hunter. It's when he says, I got home and you guys took care of me and I didn't have one infection. And that was their scare the whole time. And what I saw, guys, the rate of recovery and what he went through was the most superhuman thing I've ever seen. And the doctors, told my mother to her face, I was there, that, my father was a medical miracle, that they have no idea how he was bouncing back so fast, that, the fact that he wanted to go home after 6 weeks and was able to, they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe his rate of recovery. Now, 3/4 of his body to his, basically from just below his neck to, like, it'd be like if you put on a t-shirt, there was, 1.5 inches thick of scar tissue all the way down to below his belly. And then his legs were just all scar tissue down to his ankles. And I know there were 2 things that he was happy with, at least, after it was done. It's one that, his face didn't get completely mangled or burned. In fact, his face didn't have any burns on it. His ears did. He had scar tissue on his ears, but not his face. And, not to be too straightforward, but the fire didn't get his private parts, man. And if you're a man, you know how important that would be, to just feel like a man and not be like, hey, my dick didn't get burned off, I'm not trying to be funny here. I'm being dead serious, man. So he was battling back. He was determined that he was going to find a way back. And not only did he come back from that, and listen, every morning I watched him wake up, and the first thing he had to do, whenever he would go to sleep, that scar tissue tightens when you sleep, and his hands would tighten like into these, just like fists. And every morning he'd have to wake up and go out and do these excruciating stretches to stretch that scar tissue out. And I mean, this is every morning of his life. And the same thing, the scar tissue on his stomach would pull him forward, where he'd be like he's standing up but leaning forward like, a good 30, 40 degrees. And he'd have to stand straight up and put his arms above his head, and grab this, like this bar and hang on it to stretch his stomach out, the scar tissue. And this is excruciating. And I watched him do it every morning. And I watched him fight all the way back to the point where he was jogging 10 miles a day. 10 miles a day when it was cold out. He couldn't jog when it was hot out because scar tissue doesn't sweat. So he would wait till it'd be just icy cold in the winter, and which is like 9 months out of the year in Iowa. And he got to the point where he was, jogging outside like 10 miles a day. And on days it was too hot, he had a running machine in the house. And listen, if that shit ain't superhuman, I don't know what is. And, but he wasn't done. He wasn't done with these incredible comebacks. I'm 18 years old, hanging out in Neola. Laura was a lifeguard at the local pool. I had just been swimming all day. I go across the street to get an ice cream cone. I turn around. I see my mother's car pull up. She's just screaming, "Chad, get in the car, get in the car. It's your dad, it's your dad." Well, my dad had gotten to the point where he was riding Harleys again with his best friend, my Uncle Mike, who unfortunately now has passed away as well. And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she was like, "It's your dad. Get in the car now." So I hop in the car, and she's telling me, there's this overpass right where I lived in Persia, Iowa. And it's known for like blowing semis, like from completely picking them up and throwing them off the road. It's just the way the winds come off the bluffs and come down. It's just this like perfect storm for these little wind traps that just have a ton of power. Well, my dad was on his Harley, coming back from a ride, going about 75 miles an hour, went under this wind pass, and a gust literally pushed his bike completely off the road, in which he flew off his bike at 75 miles an hour and went flying into the big concrete support like columns that hold up the bridge above it. Multiple witnesses to it, like a ton of people called it in. They all thought he was dead. They show up, they pick him up, and they take him down to the hospital in Omaha. They transport him. The same thing, man. I show up with my mother. She goes and talks to everybody in the ER, and I could hear her screaming back there and just fighting with them that her son's, is with her, and I need to see him. If he's going to go, I need to see him. And again, they didn't think he was going to make it. They thought he had a traumatic brain injury, and man, his body was fucked up, man. So suddenly my mother walks out and she says, "Come back here now. Come back here now. If you want to see your dad now." And I'm like, okay. And I go back. And again, my dad's laying on this gurney. A bunch of teeth are knocked out. His left hand, his hand is just below where his elbow is. So that left arm that was saved is just shattered. And the same thing with his right leg. Just below his knee is his foot, but his foot is facing inward. So it's not forward, it's inward. Literally his toes are pointing at his other leg. He has got just massive patches of scar tissue that are just ripped from his body. His head is super swollen. He has like this, oh God, what do you call it when like I've seen it happen to boxers when they get hit and it looks like all the blood swells in one area. It's like this big contusion, and uh, I didn't know what to say, and I said, "Hey, Dad," and he looks at me, looks kind of confused, and he says, "Hey, boy," and I said, "You okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, why?" And I'm like, "Well, Dad, you got in an accident. You got thrown off your motorcycle." And he goes, "What? No, I didn't. No." And I go, "Yeah, you got really hurt, Dad. You're in a bad way, you know." And he's like, "No, no, no, that didn't happen. I'd remember that." And I'm like standing there, and I'm like, "Yeah, it did." And I stop and I just go, Dad, relax, just relax. It's all good." 2 seconds goes by, he looks at me and goes, "Hey, boy." And I'm like, "Hey, Dad, you all right?" "Yeah, why?" I'm like, "'Cause you got in the motorcycle accident." "Huh?" I'm like, "Yeah, you got thrown off your bike." "No, no, what? No, I didn't. I'm okay. I remember that." I'm like, "Oh, shit." I'm like, "Dad, just like calm down." And he's like, "Just relax." 2 seconds goes by. "Hey, boy." His brain was just resetting over and over again. I mean, literally, like over and over again. And I was just like, "Oh, fuck, man. Oh, fuck. The motherboard's gone, Like, oh my God." I'm just staring at him. I look back at the doctor, look back at my mother. Everyone's kind of silent. I look back. I'm like, "Why don't you just rest, Dad?" 2 seconds goes by. "Hey, boy." I'm like, "Oh, fuck, man. I can't deal with this." I turned around. I said, "Dad, I love you so fucking much, man." I'm like, "If you're in there, just fight. Fight. I love you. God, I love you." And I turned around and I looked at the doctor and I was just like, "You work on him, man. Do something. I'm good." No one's got to. I just felt selfish. I was just like, I don't need to see him. Work on him. Get him better. I'm sorry, guys. So, anyways, so yeah, I left that day. Same thing, man. It was back to the same thing. I was just like, does he have 9 lives? Is this like number three? You know what I mean? And I thought like I said, I thought the motherboard's fried. I thought the brain's gone. I'm like, what? What? Geez, we haven't dealt with this before. We've dealt with physical. We've seen him fight through that. And I'm like, how will he ever get through this? And man, how did he get through it? Super fucking human ability, man. Day by day, he fought through it. They ended up putting external fixators. You ever seen, like, if you don't know what an external fixator is, if you look at Doctor Strange, the movie Doctor Strange, after he gets his hands fucked up, um, there's these basically iron rods that go into your bone and come out of your body, and they all connect. So it's just held, like your hands and your legs, wherever the external fixator is. It's just held to where your bones are fixated, and they put cartilage around it. And it's basically what happens when the bone is just crushed, and they're trying to rebuild bone, so they don't have to amputate. And he had an external fixator on his arm. They literally pulled his arm out of his elbow all the way back down, reconstructed the bone, put these iron rods in. Same thing with his leg. And, you know, uh, every day he would have to walk around the house, and those things are big and awkward and janky. And there was times where he would accidentally bang the fixator against like the edge of a door, or he'd get caught on like blankets or something, and it would just rock him with pain, man. That was just unbelievable. Slowly but surely, his mind ended up being okay. He had massive brain swelling, that was just causing his brain to go wonky. The doctors were incredibly blown away by how quickly that came back. He did regain full memory of the accident, and he remembered everything that happened. And he literally just said he turned the corner and he got hit by a gust of wind that, he said it must have been 60, 70 miles an hour. Just bam, just hit him. And we know that's possible because, like, semi trucks get literally thrown off this impasse all the time, or this bypass. And he did. He fought his way all the way back. And right when I think that he's really, really going to beat this, he gets severe staph infection in his leg. Which, oh man, he was sick. Oh God, he was so sick. And they were talking about amputating his leg again. He just said, no, I'm not doing that. I can beat this. Give me the medicine. I'll beat it. And he said he beat it with prayer and, laying hands on himself. And my dad was a big believer in the laying hands, which is basically healing through touch, through the power of God. Those are his beliefs. And again, it was working, so I'm not going to tell him he was wrong. And he made it all the way back. Made it through the staff, all that shit. I remember the day they took those rods out, and I saw him walking. I came home from school. It was like my last week of school. And I saw him walking. And I'm like, how is that possible? How is that possible? Years later, during the American Ghost Hunter filming, Lorraine Warren, when that day in which my mother's issues were confronted, Lorraine said to me, your father's a saint. I said, you think so? And she goes, he is a saint. And she said, he was put here to protect you. She said, that's why he fights so hard to stay around. I said, you really think so? And she goes, I know so. She said, that's why he hasn't crossed over yet. She said, he won't until he knows you'll be okay. She said, that man's a saint. And it's kind of weird that whenever my dad had someone to fight for, to protect, he was okay. And then on his 50th anniversary, things between he and my mother came to a head. And out of respect for him, I won't speak on what happened, but suffice to say, he and my mother got a divorce, and he was alone. And at that point, he didn't have anybody to protect anymore and try his best to heal. Only then did he pass away. It took 6 months, and he was gone. And he was proud of that. Like, he was proud. Man, my dad was, he was proud of me. Like I said, when he moved me out here to California, he had tears in his eyes, which he rarely ever cried. When he was getting ready to leave, and I gave him a big hug, and I said, Dad, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back and see you. Don't worry. And he looked at me and said, Chad, don't you ever come back. He was crying because he was happy that I escaped all that shit. So do I think there's superhumans? Yeah. Yeah, I do. And Rod Calek was one of them. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Much love, everybody. I'll be back tomorrow with more. All the best.